Hello. This is the first time in the history of the working world where we have 5 distinctly different generations coming into the same office every day together. Typically, there's one leader in charge of those 5 generations, and it's really important for that person to be able to, in turn, be able to work with these people, motivate them, get them engaged, and have them produce quality work. So I'm here today to kind of give you the 5-1-1 on the generations so that you have a more clear understanding of how you can then, in turn, reach out, interact, and have successful dealings with these people. So, first thing we want to talk about is a little bit about who those generations are and what the people are that are in those generations. So the generation that's been in the workforce the longest is called the veterans generation. They have typically been in the workforce longer than any other generation that has come before them, and there's a lot of reasons behind that. Some of it comes from corporate downsizing, some of it comes from the fact that they retired and they were sort of bored and they've decided to come back to work, and some of it also is a volunteer type of situation. They've had the most hierarchical careers and have really been associated with their titles that they've had through the years. And as a result, they've climbed that corporate ladder and they expect that there is sort of a militaristic approach to work. The next generation that came after them, and is the largest generation of all times, is the boomer generation. And they are an interesting group because they are very competitive, but they're also very altruistic. Sometimes they're referred to as the Peace Corps generation because they were the ones that actually were in a position to help get the Peace Corps started and so forth. They live to work. You can thank the boomers for the 80-hour work week. They're the ones who created that. But on the flip side of that equation, they're also the ones who really want to make things work more effectively and efficiently in the workforce. After the boomers comes Gen X. Gen X was the first group to really be affected by corporate downsizing when they watched their parents get laid off. So their idea of loyalty to a company is completely different from the generations which came before. They realize that they will likely have between 4 and 7 distinct careers during their lifetimes. Not jobs, careers. So they have the motto of, I'm going to work to live. Work-life balance is more important to me because I know that I'm going to have to seek out positions that are really going to work around what I need for my family's life. Following Gen X is Gen Y, and they are more of what would be considered lattice careers. So Gen Y was the group that was affected by the dot-com bust when they first started into the workforce. And so they realized that longevity with a corporation is just not the way it was when their parents entered the workforce. So they will take positions that might be a lateral move, sometimes a backwards move, sometimes another sideways move before they can move up. So it's not hierarchical like the veterans generation. It's more like a lattice that you would see on a fence. And then last but not least is the generation that is now starting to enter the workforce called the Echo Boomers. They're second in size to the Boomer generation. And the thing that's interesting about them is since preschool, they have been working together in teams. And they are sometimes known as the participation trophy generation because they've been getting trophies ever since they were in preschool for various things. So you've got these 5 different groups, these 5 different things of, looking at ways of looking at things. And also, too, you've got the opportunity as a leader to bring them together, harness that power that comes from having this multi-generational group, and build a better team. So, how does work get done? Well, if you were from the previous generations, you had a much more structured work environment. There were meetings with agendas, there were deadlines, there were papers that had to be due by XYZ date and time. So as a result, you led a very structured life at work. Now, the generations that are entering the workforce expect something called funderstanding. In other words, when you're taught something new, it should be interesting, it should be compelling, it should have some kind of draw to keep you focused. They also expect something called reverse mentoring. So mentoring in generations previous was something that you earned, an opportunity to have a mentoring relationship in the workforce. The new generations that are entering in expect to be able to be mentored from day one. So there's a nice symbiotic type of relationship that's emerging called reverse mentoring, where the newer people coming into the workforce are able to share some of their skills, maybe more advanced technical capabilities, abilities to use Excel spreadsheets more effectively, and so forth, and they're teaching the people who are there to acclimate them to the corporation. So this reverse mentoring is really helping in workforces to be able to get people better attuned faster and also teach some of the people that have been there for a while some of the newer technologies. So you've got one leader working with 5 generations. How do they handle it? How would they really communicate more effectively, and how would they get the points across that they need to be able to deliver to their demands? They have to become what's called a culture hacker. And this is sort of a new phrase that's emerging in the human resources world, and it's really all about just making small changes to improve the environment in which you're focusing. So some of the things you can do is just change the way you word things. Make sure you're aware of how the generations like to be approached. You know, the younger generations would prefer to be communicated through email, and email comes across their smartphone, so it's an instant-on application. That still appeals to the generations that have been in the workforce longer, because then they can print it out. Because believe me, to the previous generations, that that piece of paper in their hand is sort of the gospel that they go by. So this opportunity to use email as a vehicle for all generations will certainly make a difference. Make sure, too, that you're constantly reaching out to those groups so that you can figure out where they're at, if they have questions, if they're confused, if what you're doing is working. And take those surveys. You know, they don't have to be formal 400-question surveys, but they should be out there frequently enough so that you're really taking the pulse of your group. And lastly, create a more visual environment. Sometimes workplaces tend to be very sterile environments, and there's not much to look at and so forth. And interestingly enough, people will retain more information if they're engaged using more than one sense. So if you do have posters on the wall, or if you have like little motivational quotes hanging up in the break room and so forth, it creates an environment that sort of begets more creativity as a result. So these are different ways by which you can kind of become a culture hacker as a leader and create a much more collaborative environment. There's a new term that's also emerging in this space of a multi-generational workforce, and it's the term called coopertition. That's not a typo. Really what it stands for is a combination of 2 words, and it means both cooperating with one another, competing with one another, and collaborating with one another at the same time. So as a result, you end up with this opportunity to harness the power of people's intrinsic desire to perform well. And when you do that, you create an environment that's slightly competitive with one another and also offers the opportunity for people to excel. This really appeals to the various generations. Boomers, remember I told you they were very competitive. So they will really try to outdo the rest of their coworkers in gaining, awards and completing work ahead of schedule and so forth. Echo boomers will also follow suit with that because they too really crave that attention and that opportunity to get that participation trophy. Veterans will appeal to veterans as well because they like to be able to hang certificates of completion on their walls and so forth. And Gen X and Gen Y really appreciate the opportunity to learn from one another, work collaboratively, but autonomously at the same time, and then be able to break and fix things and put things back together again differently. So cooperation is really something that a leader should take advantage of within their teams to be able to make an impact and a difference. So, as a leader, as a coworker even, you need to understand the point of rewarding performance. And one of the nicest things that you can do is really reach them the way they want to be reached. Giving someone, 2 days off may not have the same impact because from their generational perspective, it is in the high impact recognition. So people will always do better if you give them, the chance and the opportunity to really feel like they're appreciated. And as a result, you want to take the opportunity to understand how they like to be rewarded. So you'll notice that the echo boomers and the veterans prefer like those framed awards. I worked for many years with a man who was from the veterans generation, and he probably had an office that was maybe 6 by 8, so very small. Big desk in there, file cabinet, chair. There really wasn't much room. But floor to ceiling on every visible space of wall was a framed certificate of a class he had taken or an award he was given and so forth. Very important to him to be able to showcase that. So be aware of that and understand that if that's how they prefer to be recognized, then that you're actually producing recognition in that venue. Obviously, everybody likes money, so a bonus that is monetary is always appreciated, but Gen X and Gen Y, because they're very learning-centric, and actually Gen X is our very best read generation of all times, they would actually prefer the opportunity to go to a symposium, some kind of webinar, or anything along those lines that's going to let them learn more about their topics of interest. And then last but not least, the echo boomers also really appreciate that public announcement, because don't forget, they're new, and they're trying to establish their place and feel like they fit in and so forth. And statistics say that if you've got a new employee, regardless of their age and where they've come from previously, if they don't find some kind of generational touch point with a coworker within 6 months, they'll leave that company within a year because they don't feel like they fit or belong. So if you've got these opportunities to recognize them, share with them the fact that they are appreciated, you're also increasing your retention rates within the corporation as well. So, change management as a leader is really an important process, but it's even more important when you're dealing with a multi-generational group, because if you don't promote the change, if you don't communicate the change, and if you don't keep the change flowing using some of the verbiage that they prefer, then you're going to lose some of the generations. So, the biggest thing to remember is this basic 5-step formula up here. You need to make sure that you share the vision, you tell them the skills that are required, you let them know what the incentives will be throughout the change period, you provide them with the resources they need to be successful, and you also share the action plan. If you do those 5 simple steps, regardless of who you're dealing with, every one of the generations will feel secure in this change environment. But you notice if you start blacking out one of those steps at each one of the levels in the process, you're going to end up with anxiety, frustration, resistance, etc. And that goes across the generations. But pay specific attention to the fact that the veterans and the boomers really want you to provide detail. Remember, they're the ones who are going to print it out, have it at their desk so that they can recall what happens next. Gen X, you really want to make sure that you're addressing all of their concerns. Since they're the best read generation, they're going to have statistics about other companies going through the similar type of change, and as a result, they're going to be sort of your naysayers unless you really keep them involved. Gen Y and Echoes, they really want to understand the impact of the change and also how it can help them grow as a result. So communicate that information to them as well, following that 5-step formula, and you will actually end up with a very successful change that will have very little negative impact in your organization. So, there are different tools that you can use as a leader or a coworker to help with this change process. One of them is called a RACI diagram, and that stands for responsible, accountable, communicated, and informed. So, if you use a RACI chart to be able to let people know who's doing what when during a change effort, it really alleviates a lot of the stress. It makes sure that everybody understands and is very clear on who's going to do what when, and it gives dates and time frames as well. So this is a reassuring factor, and it will make sure that the generations that have been in the workforce the longest are acknowledged for the work that they're doing, and that their knowledge is appreciated by the audience. Another powerful tool is called the Ishikawa diagram, or the fishbone diagram. Some of you may have heard of it before. This is used to kind of review cause and effect. So if something starts to go wrong within a change effort, this is a great tool to use because you can track what's happening, why it's happening, and then assign people to deal with it and eradicate it. Gen X and Gen Y really like the simplicity of it because you can literally go into a room as a team and come out a couple hours later with a very well-developed action plan to deal with the issues that are in the environment currently. So, there's 5 generations, 5 different sets of expectations. And we especially need to know how to harness all of that, pull it together, and make it advantageous to us as leaders. So you've got the depth and breadth of experience that comes from having a multi-generational group. You've got the ability to pull them together quickly because they do have, that ability to get together in a more quick fashion. There's technical expertise, but there's also historical perspective. And those 2 elements are extremely important because you don't get them if you've only got one type of group pulled together. So having that new age ability combined with the old information that's really going to be important to the effort will really make a difference for you. So when you're leading a group that's made up of 5 totally different generations, you have to remember certain things. You have to focus on work-life balance. So remember we talked about at the very beginning, the veterans really preferred that structure, that hierarchical opportunity to move up the ladder. They would drag themselves into work sick as a dog because nobody calls them sick. So that's something that you have to bear in mind. The boomers, very competitive as we remember. They're the type that will be in a training class and will answer every single question. And God forbid that the instructor is handing out like candy or something when somebody gets a question correct. Because what that boomer will do is line that candy right up in front of them and look at the person next to them who has 1 piece and they have 42. Who knows more than who? So you've got to kind of harness that too. But one of the things that really emerges with this idea of work-life balance is that those who live to work, the veterans and the boomers, have started to take less of an impact and have less of sort of a foothold in the organization. And the younger generations, Gen X, Gen Y, and now the Echoes, are starting to drive corporate programs more and more. You're seeing greater work-life balance opportunities through corporations because they're trying to maintain and retain those younger generations because they will leave a company to find better opportunities for those balances. When you want to influence engagement as a leader, you truly have to understand how to reward them, as we talked about, and also how to lead them through change so that they don't become overwhelmed by the thought of what's happening and how it's going to affect them in their professional lives. If you reassure them and ensure that they understand the message, then they will stay with you as long-term employees much more solidly than they would if you were just kind of theoretically throwing the change at them and not giving them any follow-up. When you want to make sure that you're harnessing the power of that multi-generational group, it's really important to pay attention to the fact that they have so many different facets to bring together that you can really harness that power and put forth the best possible team to be able to provide support to your customers. But there are things you have to be aware of. You can't ignore this and tune this out and cover your ears and pretend it isn't happening. This is going to be the way of work moving forward. And since boomers and veterans are staying in the workforce far longer than ever before, this 5-generational situation isn't going to change anytime soon. So taking, sort of a nap on this and thinking everything will be better tomorrow is not going to happen. You have to be aware of the needs of each of the generations and address them so that you have a more effective workplace. Also, too, each generation has its own lens. this little person can't see through those glasses. So you have to make sure that you're sharing the right information at the right time with the right people. And that comes with understanding who makes up your teams. And last but not least, if you've got the equation right, you can actually move forward with the team and produce not only a successful result for your organization, but for the corporation, and most importantly, for the employees themselves. So that's the 511 on the generations. I hope that if you've remembered nothing more from this talk than what I've shared with you here today, just keep in mind that it's up to you to be able to harness that power, motivate that group to move forward, and also in turn make it a fun work environment whereby they can learn and grow together. So thanks.